Perfect. Well, thanks for joining us today. I'm Brendan. We're going to be chatting a bit about the high performance building codes within Indigenous communities. In a little bit here, we're going to pass it off to Trevor and Shauna, but I would like to just first start with land acknowledgement. So if we could pass on to the next slide there. So Eco-Canada's commitment to reconciliation starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to work and live within the Treaty 7 territory. Eco-Canada acknowledges the traditional territories and oral practices of the NECB within the home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda, which include the Chickchikni, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. In addition, the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nations of Alberta. Personally, I'm in Kelowna, British Columbia today, with home of the unceded territory of the Okanagan Siksika Nations. So I just want to say we're really grateful for the different territories that we have all lived and worked upon as well. So, we have a little video here to... Yeah, go ahead, Trevor.
Sure.
Way, Jilasi. The people that have put this session together have worked all across Turtle Island. But the coordinating organization, Blue House Energy, is located on the East Coast in Mi'kma'ki. Being connected to that land, we also choose to root our work in Etowuptimunk, or two-eyed seeing. This is a foundational concept that has been lifted up and shared across the world by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall.
We have to coexist with these people that are here. But you have every legal prerogative for you to determine what best you want from that culture. Because you already know you have the best of what you have from your culture that has been passed on from your ancestors. And you have this legal prerogative, put those two concepts together so that it'll better prepare you to meet whatever challenges may be. Every that one takes has to be in harmony with nature. And if we were to humble ourselves and embrace this concept of two-eyed seeing to help us to mitigate some of those mistakes that have been made and that we are making, and only then I believe we will then be able to say, I fulfilled my inherent responsibilities why I was placed here.
Two-eyed seeing offers a perfect framework for all that we're about to discuss, even the most technical aspects of our session. As your leadership team, we are grateful for Elder Albert's teaching and the way it can ground the critical work that so many communities are facing.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that there, Trevor. Okay, so Eco-Canada is hosting this information session and this workshop. So I thought we'd go over quickly what Eco-Canada does. So we are the steward for the Canadian environmental workforce across all industries. Essentially, it's our job to help the environmental industry grow and thrive. We're a not-for-profit that has federal funding for wage subsidies, as well as different research projects we do. But the way to think of us is that if you're in the environmental industry, it's our job to help you grow. So if you're an environmental company, we can help you grow through training your employees, finding great people through our job board, our HR services that can help you also find and train great people. And if you're an environmental professional, we have different certification for you so you can show your environmental skills. We have different trainings as well, and we can help you find positions. So anything that environmental professionals or environmental companies need, that's what we do to try and grow and help them out as much as possible. Specifically now, we're going to talk about one of our programs, the BEAR program. It fits in very nicely with what we're going to be talking about today in the session. But a little bit of background information on the BEAR program is that it started in 2006. And since then, we've helped over 3,900 learners get some basic environmental skills. So the BEAR program is really focused on three things. Number one, it's short-term, high impact. So it's not going to replace a university degree or diploma. It's really focused on getting participants into industrial or environmental roles after they finish the program. So courses are usually about 3 to 7 weeks, and they can go longer as well. But they're very short-term and focused on employability afterwards. Number two, it really focuses on braiding together Western sciences with traditional knowledge. So we get different traditional knowledge holders to come out and work with the different BEAR trainers that we have to really braid together the two-eyed seeing approach that we've just kind of chatted about in that video as well. And number three, it's all done on communities. So all trainers will come to different communities to help deliver the training so that learners don't have to leave site as well. Now, if we go to the next slide there, we have 4 different kind of goals of BEAR. So overarching our main goal is to help build capacity in different Indigenous nations. And these 4 goals kind of help support that as well. So support acquisition of meaningful employment in the environmental sector, deliver relevant job training and employability skills, facilitate capacity building in Indigenous communities, and foster partnerships in the environmental sector. All that to say is that the BEAR program is there to help different communities build their environmental capacity so they have a pool of talented environmental workers from their own nation that can work on their own territory and land without having to move it and go anywhere too. If you'd like more information, you can always email us at bear, BEAHR, @eco.ca for more information we can help with there. But I'll hand this off to Pooja now, and she'll give you some more information on the background of the program.
Thank you, Brandon. I didn't realize I was muted. So yeah, thank you. So this project, this training is being developed thanks to the funding from, hold on. Okay, so this training has been developed thanks to the financial support of the National Resources Canada, and it is funded by the Government of Canada. This training is part of the court's acceleration program within Indigenous Communities project. That project's aim is to significantly accelerate the adoption and implementation of the most advanced energy performance building codes within Indigenous communities. And through this project, we will be developing essential skills and also support to Indigenous communities to adopt the building codes. We'll also be developing training such as this to increase the awareness of benefits of adopting the building codes, and also establishing network of Indigenous energy efficiency champions to share knowledge. The other aspect of this project is also to develop trainings to support, again, Indigenous communities to adopt and facilitate and implement energy building codes. So yeah, this is this. If you would like to learn more about the project, or if you would like to partner with us, there will be survey at the end. Please do mention that you would like to learn more about it, and we'll reach out to you after the training. Next slide, please, Trevor. Right, as you may have heard in the beginning, this training is put together by 2 experts. One is from the Blue House Energy, which is based in Mi'kma'ki, and has been providing education in building science, home constructions, and renovation since 2012. And our trainer, our instructor, is from Bawadi Building Science, which was getting in 2022 and is based in Kettle and Stony Point First Nation, which provides training in building science services by and for Indigenous people. Now, I'll introduce our 2 wonderful experts who will be taking you through the entire training program. First off, we have Trevor Trainer. Trevor is the president and building science specialist. He specializes in the performance of wall and roof system in extreme cold climates and applying the principles of building science to Indigenous housing issues. And next we have Shauna. She is the CEO and the co-founder of Blue House Energy, which she founded in 2012. She's been working in the energy efficient housing since 1992. So a lot of experience behind her, like over 30 plus years of experience behind her. And other than the recognized as a leader in residential building science, she also is a subject matter expert for several publications. She writes regularly on online magazines, and she's also the author of two books. So yeah, welcome, and please take it away, Trevor.
Great, thanks, Pooja. So today we're going to talk about the building code and several building codes for that matter. And we're going to try and talk about them and considering them as tools instead of rules. And this is a really interesting, I think, and maybe different way to look at building codes. In section 1, we're going to talk about current housing issues and the building code sort of in context. In section 2, we're going to talk a little more detail about high performance building codes and how they can help us develop our housing sovereignty within our communities. And then at the end, we're going to really get into some examples and ways in which we can use these new high performance building codes as tools and not just look at them as a set of rules, and kind of try and bring it all together in section 3. If you have questions while they come up, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. Shauna will be monitoring that, and she can interrupt me at the appropriate time to ask those questions. Between each of those 3 sections, there's going to be a 10-minute break. And either Shauna or I or both will be online during those breaks to answer questions or to have further discussions if there's a sort of a topic that we haven't covered. And so we'll try and make those a little more interactive during the 10-minute break. Bear with me while I figure out exactly all the technical ways to run this. There we go. So into part 1, we're going to talk about why codes are important, what we can do with them. The first thing we're going to do is kick off with a poll, though. Are we ready with the polls, Natoya?
Hello, everyone. So I sent an invite in the chat for a Mentimeter program which we'll be using to do the polls today. If you just click the link, it will take you directly to the screen so that you can enter your information.
Do I need to stop screen sharing for you to do that, or we can stay
No,
in?
it's fine.
Okay.
So the first question we have is, tell us where you're joining us from today. So you may go ahead and type in your responses. I just want to have an idea of where you're joining us from today.
And Natoya, just to add, I can't see the results coming in, so if you could summarize them for us, that would be great.
Okay, I'll try. So we have Halifax, Harris Sound. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the first part of that word. North Bay, Ontario. In the chat, we have Calgary, Vancouver, Bearberry, Alberta, Winnipeg,
Yeah, that's a pretty wide audience. That's great. From different areas of the country.
Thank you.
And I guess we have a second poll question coming up, and that would be, I think, what is your community's stance on adopting building codes?
So that's our next poll. What, if any, is your community's stance or position on the need to adopt a building code? I'm not seeing the responses.
That's okay. We may have more to talk about on that line later in the presentation. So we'll kind of leave that out there for now. So what we're going to try and do now is put the building code into context. One thing we know about housing is that a house is not just a building. You know, housing impacts a lot of areas of our lives. It impacts our social lives, right? How we interact with our family members and friends. Economically, it's very important. The cost of housing, as we know, both owning and running a home can be very expensive. It can affect our economic parts of our lives. It can affect the environment. Well, our home is in itself an interior environment that's really important, and also the building can affect the environment around it. So it's important to understand what those impacts are on the environment and to create a healthy environment for us. And that was the last one, is that our housing also affects our health, the air we breathe, whether housing encourages us to do things like go outside or stay inside, and what are the conditions inside the house and how they affect our health. Those are all really important. So it's not just a building, it's something that affects all areas of our lives. So one thing we like to really mention up front is that building codes, the ones we're going to talk about, and codes in general, really specify a minimum acceptable level of safety, right? So the primary purpose of building codes is life safety. So specifically structure, to make sure our buildings don't fall down on top of us, and fire, to make sure that they don't catch on fire and put us into a safety situation that way. And if they do catch on fire, how long does it take them? Can we get out quickly and safely? And it's also important to remember that building codes have been developed and are meant to be applied to permanent structures, right? Permanent homes, permanent buildings. Permanent year-round structures are relatively new in many Indigenous cultures, right? Over, the last 100 years, in many cases, moving to year-round permanent structures was sort of forced upon us. And much of the traditional knowledge we have related to seasonal dwellings and living off the land doesn't really apply to permanent housing. It's kind of hard to apply it. And so we have a bit of a knowledge gap there that we're always trying to work with. And the other issue that is really important is that communities typically have not been consulted on the design of their permanent housing. A lot of times, many times, it's been housing designs taken from the South and moved into Indigenous communities and even, really far north, without making appropriate changes to them to adapt to the climate, to adapt to lifestyle differences. And that's resulted in a lot of cases in inappropriate designs and housing that doesn't last, that doesn't hold up under the conditions it's being exposed to. One of the issues that we see quite regularly in Indigenous communities, and especially in the north and in the far north, in the Arctic, are overcrowded conditions. And we know that overcrowded conditions will affect how a house performs. So Canadian census data shows us that Indigenous people, especially those living on reserve and in the north, are much more likely to live in housing that requires significant repairs and in housing that is overcrowded. And those two are often related to each other. Common issues that we see in Northern Indigenous housing include things like leaky roofs, wet crawl spaces, poor ventilation, all of things which cause moisture issues in the building and the building to decay quickly. And require major repairs or make that building unlivable in a short period of time. We've seen that in multiple examples, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So these issues, in combination with overcrowding, have led to a lot of mold and poor indoor air quality issues, which have other issues related to health, right? As we know, breathing in air with mold or having mold exposure on our skin can create health problems, including asthma, respiratory diseases, and skin conditions. And we'll talk a bit about a few examples coming up on that. So by the numbers, I'm like an engineer, and I like to, see the numbers and understand them in terms of statistics. So what we do know from census data is that overall, 1 in 5 Indigenous people live in crowded housing. We also know that these levels are much higher on reserve and in northern communities. So for example, in Nunavut territory, 60% of households are overcrowded. So we see much higher levels of overcrowding in Indigenous communities, especially northern Indigenous communities, compared to the rest of Canada. Also, Indigenous people are 3 times more likely to live in a dwelling that needs major repairs than non-Indigenous people in Canada. On reserve, and especially in northern communities, that could be up to 6 times more likely, depending on the region that we're looking at. And then information from the Assembly of First Nations has estimated that we need currently about 51,000 new homes in order to address the overcrowding issues that we have. And then also, just as importantly, or maybe more importantly, we have 81,000 houses in desperate need of renovation and fixing up. So there's sort of 2 issues here. One is that the houses we live in need to be repaired, and the others, we need new housing also, so that we can reduce the overcrowded conditions that we're seeing, especially in the north. One example of a major issue that has actually had some media attention was in 2019, the Cat Lake First Nation, when they declared a state of emergency. So this community in Northern Ontario, 700 houses that were reviewed. Of the 700 that were reviewed, 128 houses were inspected because they had risk of high levels of mold, and 110 of them were shown to have excessive levels of mold in the houses, resulting in 87 of them being deemed uninhabitable. And so this is sort of one example of these issues that obviously occur in many of our communities, but came to a head in this case where the state of emergency had to be declared due to medical conditions, mostly with children, 100 children in need of medical care because of the mold in these houses, and a series of evacuations that occurred during that time. So obviously, this is one example, and we all sort of see this in a lot of communities on a smaller scale or on a different scale, but one that got a lot of attention. So one of the things we know about overcrowded housing and housing that maybe has poor water control is that we get a lot of moisture issues inside the house. So high levels of interior moisture, high levels of humidity can create issues inside our house. So we've all seen condensation on a window. And so that's one thing that is visible and that, can be at least wiped away. But the same thing, the same type of condensation can be occurring inside of walls and inside of roof systems. And this is the type of moisture issues that we don't see, and the mold we don't see right away that's growing inside of our walls or roofs.
Yeah, Trevor,
yeah.
I'm just going to jump in because
Yeah.
this is just a giant problem in houses that are built out of wood in general. Moisture is the enemy number 1 for wood framed houses in any climate, but the colder you get, the more extreme the environment, whether it's colder or even wetter on the West Coast, then wood just doesn't like moisture. And we keep having the problems are more pronounced.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I don't think we'll be moving away from building our houses out of wood anytime soon, but there are a lot of design strategies, and some of which we'll talk about, that can help us control moisture in our wood framed homes.
I think for you and I, that's our favorite rabbit hole to fall down.
Yes, exactly. Designing wood framed walls and roof systems for extreme cold environments is what I've been working on a lot over the last 5 or 10 years. So, there are solutions, and there are some answers in the code, and some areas where we're going to talk about where we need to go above and beyond code in order to address these issues. And so why is mold bad? Obviously, I think we know this, but condensation leads to mold, which can cause skin and respiratory, issues, especially in young people. And it also results in our buildings rotting and decaying and becoming structurally unsound very quickly too. So between the poor indoor air quality and the structural damage that occurs due to moisture, it's something that we really need to address and take very seriously. So one of the questions we get, especially outside of Indigenous communities, is why is there so much overcrowding? So one thing that we need to realize is that our Indigenous communities, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are 3 of the highest growing populations in Canada. So we have a really high level of population growth, and we have more housing that we need to house these people, to house our people. We have a history of inappropriate housing, right? Over the past 30 years, we've seen a lot of inappropriate designs and poor quality construction that decays really quickly, that needs major repairs, that becomes uninhabitable after a short period of time. In the building code, typically it's expected that a house needs to perform its functions for 30 to 50 years. And in many Indigenous communities, we're seeing a much shorter lifespan than that for our housing. And we need to deal with that, so that when we invest in housing, we're investing in something that lasts and can provide shelter and a safe place for many generations. And so due to this history and high population growth, many Indigenous households often have multi-generation and extended families living in one home. And typically that's more, people living in the home than was ever understood or expected when that house was designed. The other factor we need to always consider is that the cost of building, especially in the north. So we've seen that the housing shortage, and as we try and build new homes, we realize that building a home in the north, even in a relatively accessible city in the north, like Iqaluit, which has a major airport and seaport, and has on-site labor to build these houses, can be 3 times higher than building that same house in Toronto. And once we get into more isolated communities, fly-in only communities, communities that don't have their own infrastructure or a capacity to build houses and have to have workers flown in to do that, we can see housing that costs another 50% higher than Iqaluit, so 4 to 5 times higher than building a house in Toronto. So these are all factors that we need to address and work with when we're trying to solve the housing shortage in our Indigenous communities, especially in our northern and more remote northern Indigenous communities. So how can we relate overcrowding to the building code? Well, what we know is that moisture puts stress on a building, right? And the building code is there to make sure that the building can take the stresses we're putting it upon. People who live in homes generate moisture, and the more people that live in a home, the more moisture they generate. And so buildings need to be designed and built to manage this moisture. And so if we want to avoid mold growth and that premature rot and decay of our buildings, we need to design our buildings to handle that amount of moisture. The existing building codes make some assumptions about the occupancy level of homes that may not apply in your community, especially if you are in the north, in the far north. And so we're going to talk a bit about that and other examples of where we might need to go above and beyond code at times. Fire obviously is a major issue in Indigenous communities, and it's really important from a code perspective. So house fires have long posed a major safety risk for Indigenous communities. In 2021, after several fatal fires on Ontario reserves, it was reported that the Ontario Chief Coroner described fire deaths on First Nations as jurisdictional neglect. So, whose jurisdiction is it, and how did they, let that slide? The National Fire Code addresses fire safety during the operation of facilities and buildings, ensuring the level of safety that is initially provided is maintained. So unlike other building codes, the fire code has to be, we say, is retroactive. It follows the building through its lifespan, as opposed to other parts of the code, like that are, as long as it's built to the code when you built the building, you don't need to upgrade it. When it comes to fire, we need to follow the current fire code, even on a house that was built 10 or 15 years ago. So the National Fire Code regulates certain things like what type of activities that can occur in a building, what type of maintenance needs to happen for fire safety equipment, egress, like how do we get out of the building and how we maintain doorways and stairways. Also limitations on what's inside the building, what gets stored in the building, what types of materials or hazardous products. And also it addresses having a fire safety plan for the building. So we're not going to talk a lot about the fire code, but we did want to mention that it's a very significant issue in Indigenous communities. We want to address that.
Also, there's a lot of the building, or the building code itself has a lot of those safety issues built into it, the fire safety issues built into it. So the things that you must do in the building code are actually referencing the fire code.
Exactly. Yes.
And so you don't have to know two of them.
Right. Right. Yeah. If we the part 9 of the building code specifically will address, and we'll talk more about what that is. We'll address the specific fire issues of housing. So we know that First Nations people are 10 times more likely to die in a fire than people from other communities in Canada, according to the Indigenous Fire Marshal Service. So this is a really big issue and something we need to address. Indigenous leaders and experts tie the number of high and deadly house fires on reserve to a lack of proper housing, to overcrowding, as well as to insufficient funding and education around fire protection. So we did want to address that, on its own before we get into other parts of the code. Really simple smoke alarm. It seems like a really obvious and effective way to at least alert the people who live in the home of the potential fire and when to get out. It's a low-cost device. It's legislated under fire and building codes. Unfortunately, because of it's been reported that most of the fatal fires on First Nations happened in homes that didn't have smoke alarms, or had one that was not operational, it wasn't working. And unfortunately, because of the legislative structure of how building codes are developed and how they are executed, First Nations aren't specifically required to have even something as simple as a smoke alarm by the government. That has to come from local jurisdictions and local authorities having jurisdiction, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. So now we're going to get into, at least first, the National Building Code of Canada. Up until the past few decades, building codes were focused only on life safety issues, right? Fire and structural. And codes were often perceived as just a set of rules. You just have to follow the rules when you're building or you're renovating. But things are kind of changing, as we'll talk more about as we get into more modern versions of building codes. So starting in 2006, Canada shifted to what is known as an objective-based building code. And an objective-based building code, in that type of code, every technical requirement must achieve one or more of the stated objectives in the code. So instead of just laying out a bunch of rules, we're starting with these objectives for the code. So there's 5 objectives. First one is safety, right? Obviously very important. We talked about that. Another one is health. So then we start talking about, the types of materials we have in the building, the type of ventilation systems and stuff like that get handled under health. Accessibility, how can we get safely in and out of the building? How can we accommodate those who have mobility problems getting in and out of the building? Number 4 is more structural and fire. And the 5th one, the one we're going to talk probably more about, is what they're calling environment. And that includes a lot of things, including energy efficiency, which we're going to talk a lot about, and indoor air quality. They fall under the environment category. So since 2006, the building codes have changed quite a bit, especially under that last objective, environment. Energy efficiency measures were added to the code and included a performance path to compliance. So instead of just saying you need to have R20 walls, they're saying your building as a whole needs to perform in a certain way to meet the building code. So as we move from these prescriptive-based codes, like thou shalt have R20 in your walls, to performance-based codes that say the building must be built in a way to meet certain energy requirements, we start to have more flexibility in how we design buildings and how we get to the end goal of the building code. As we move through time, the National Building Code and the National Energy Code for buildings are now moving towards a tiered code system. So the tiered code outlines a minimum energy performance, like the regular code, but also different levels of performance that exceed the minimum level. So instead of just giving one acceptable answer, there's the minimum, and then there's several above and beyond code solutions. And the reason they're doing that is to allow local jurisdictions to voluntarily adopt higher energy performance levels if they want, and also to help set a roadmap for increasing that minimum level of performance in the future. So if we already know what level 3 is and how to get there, then it becomes easier to make level 3 the base level in the future. So this new kind of code creates an opportunity for communities to approach the building code as a tool they can use, not just a set of rules. And it allows things like land-based and community-based knowledge to be incorporated into the development of safe and healthy buildings. So we're starting to have more flexibility, and we want to use that to our advantage to get more creative in our housing. So just a short history, taking a step back a bit in the history of building codes. The first building code that was ever discovered was from 3,500 years ago, from the Babylonian Empire. Obviously, they were thinking about these things as communities and as societies get more complex. They start to realize that there needs to be standards for these things. In 1666, the Great Fire of London was a major driver to creating a fire code for large cities. The Great Fire of London burned for 4 days, displaced over 200,000 people. And the result was strict new fire regulations. And also, it also brought in insurance companies into the equation.
They're already big supporters of
yeah, both of which influenced how buildings were built from then on, both the insurance companies and the fire regulations. In the 1800s, several cities, including New York, Baltimore, San Francisco, as well as some Canadian centers like St. John's, Montreal, and Toronto, and Calgary had some major fires, which brought this, codes to the forefront and produced the development of city-based building codes, and again brought on by insurance companies. You'll kind of see that as a recurring theme, that as the insurance companies get involved, they realize that standards need to be higher on how we build homes. Jumped ahead. And finally, in sort of 1941, we get into a more modern version, and the National Building Code of Canada was developed. It set standards for design and construction, including safety, health, and accessibility, as well as fire protection. So now we're starting to bring more elements of the building and the building design and performance into the building code, not just fire safety. So currently, there's 5 model codes. We call them model codes because when the way this is legislated, the government of Canada can't force these codes onto any jurisdiction, but they provide them to be adopted by the jurisdictions, either as they are or with modifications. So there's 4 model codes currently: the National Building Code, which we're going to talk mostly about. There's also the National Fire Code, National Plumbing Code, a separate code for farm buildings, and the National Energy Code for buildings. So the difference really between the National Energy Code for buildings was written specifically for larger commercial buildings and high-rise buildings, whereas the National Building Code includes energy requirements within it for on the housing. We'll talk more about that. Yeah, so why are we going with model codes? I kind of talked about how the federal government creates these model codes, and rather than legally enforceable codes. The complicated side of it is that the Constitution of Canada gives the provincial and territorial governments the authority to enact these laws and regulations that pertain to buildings and facilities. So, like I said, the government of Canada creates the model codes, but they have to be adopted by the provinces and territories. And it's up to them when they do that and how they do that, and whether they make modifications to it when they do. We'll talk about some very specific examples of that.
Yeah, I think, Trevor, I think at this point, it's also really important to note that one of the big issues with communities and housing is that housing comes under this territorial and provincial jurisdiction, but communities are under the Indian Act, which is at a federal jurisdiction. And so that's where everything is not quite meshing and mashing as we go forward.
Right, yeah. There's definitely a gap in the sort of legal structure there, and that's part of the reason why we have to talk about this today, is adopting codes and how to do that, and why it's important. And then the other side of it is the responsibility for enforcement of the codes, and that's typically delegated to local municipalities who have building officials, plumbing officials, fire officials under their employment. And so there's another layer there on the enforcement side, and that usually comes down to the municipality level. So yeah, lots of sort of layers and legal reasons as to why we're here today. We won't get into too much of that. What we will do is talk more specifically about the National Building Code. So the National Building Code has been broken down into 9 parts. Essentially, The first 8 parts, so getting through some of the just definitions and general requirements. We get specifically part 3, fire protection, occupant safety, part 4, structural design, part 5, environmental separation, part 6, heating and ventilation, part 7, plumbing, and part 8, safety measures for construction sites. Okay, all of those really apply to what we call part 3 buildings, which are larger buildings than housing typically. So some high-rise apartment buildings would be in that, but most of the housing in our small communities would come under part 9. So part 9 is a little bit of a standalone for housing and small buildings. So it includes all of the things in the other parts, but makes them simpler, more applicable to small buildings like housing and other sort of small commercial buildings. So typically, if we're talking about housing and we're talking about NBC, we're talking about part 9 usually. So yeah, the difference again, so part 3 buildings, so all of the other areas other than part 9 require design by an engineer or architect. And they include things like large multi-unit residence, so large apartment buildings, for example, large commercial and institutional buildings would all be considered part 3 buildings and would apply to parts of the code other than part 9. What we'd probably see more often in Indigenous communities are part 9 buildings. And so part 9 buildings, less than 600 square meters, just still a pretty big building, and up to 3 stories high. Those are sort of the 2 main things that make them part 9 buildings. That would include single family housing, duplexes, row houses, and low rise sort of residential and mixed commercial buildings. So yeah, the energy efficiency requirements for part 9, so housing and small buildings, is incorporated specifically into section 936 of the NBC. And they added that in 2010, and we'll get a bit more into what that looks like, since that's the primary focus of our talk today. The other thing that we're going to talk a little bit about, though, separately, is the National Energy Code for Buildings. So the National Energy Code for Buildings doesn't apply to houses. It applies to part 3 buildings. And it has 5 energy efficiency requirements. So it has elements related to the building envelope, right? The walls, the roof, the foundation of the building, how they're built, how they're designed. Lighting is a separate section. In some types of commercial buildings, lighting can be a very high energy use portion, so that's addressed in there. Heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems are addressed in section 3. Section 4 is water heating, so we call it service water heating because it might not just be for bathrooms and washing hands, it might also be for some commercial applications of hot water. And finally, electric systems and motors is in section 5. So it's broken down in that way. Quick timeline for the National Energy Code for Buildings. Was developed by the National Research Council of Canada just in 1997. Also while working with the provinces, utility suppliers, and industry stakeholders. So it was released in 1997. There's been several updates along the way. In 2011 and 2017, updates were added to increase some of the minimum requirements and also to add more flexibility in how the code gets adopted. And in 2020, this is a big change, is that we've added that tiered approach. So now there's not just a minimum that's laid out, there's a minimum and there's higher tiers or higher levels of energy efficiency that are in the code, again, to help promote going above and beyond code, and also to provide that roadmap to the future so that we can continually improve the existing code. So why is energy efficiency important in buildings? Well, one of the reasons is that residential buildings alone, so that's the light blue on the donut here, accounts for 13% of our total energy use in Canada. So that's a pretty big chunk of our energy use that we can improve and make improvements to and reduce energy on. Similarly, for greenhouse gas emissions, buildings land right around 13% of our total energy or greenhouse gas emissions nationally. And so making a change, making improvements in housing can make a big difference to our overall greenhouse gas emissions. And also, obviously this is part of our fight against climate change. Sorry, just jump back. As we look to, meet our requirements and our obligations on climate change, this is one of the major ways we can do that is by improving housing, making it more efficient. Also creating energy efficient homes and buildings with really good building envelopes and building enclosures makes it easier to switch to renewable energy for heating. And so that's really an important step in the process too, as we try and move away from fossil fuels and move to renewable electric energy. This is one of the ways we can do that. So now as we move forward in time, we're looking at sort of what the next version of the National Building Code is going to look like. So in 2019, the Standing Committee on Energy Efficiency laid the foundation for a net zero energy ready model building code by 2030. A net zero energy building is a building that can produce as much renewable energy as it consumes. Typically that's done with solar panels on the roof, and there's some exceptions where we get into wind power and other things. But typically that's done through on-site solar photovoltaic electrical generation. According to Natural Resources Canada, they're expected that a net zero energy house would be 80% more efficient than something that's built to today's building code minimums. So once we get 80% more efficient, it becomes easier to produce enough renewable energy right on site to meet the needs of the house. And now we're seeing a lot more focus on net zero energy ready buildings. So a net zero energy ready building means it's designed and modeled and constructed as the same as a net zero energy building, but it doesn't yet have the renewable energy system, but it's available in the future, especially as we get more efficient solar panels and other renewable energy sources. Having the building ready to take those and move to self-sustained net zero energy building is really important. And so part of this comes down to our obligations under the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And based on that framework, the overall goal is to reduce the carbon footprint while reducing energy loads and also making buildings healthier. We're going to talk a bit more about how that plays in along with energy efficiency as we go forward. So we talk about this tiered building code that's coming, it was introduced in 2020 for both Part 9 and Part 3 buildings. The tiered energy code, the idea is to standardize high performance buildings and work towards them. And we have two different ways we can approach all of the tiers. One is prescriptive. So the way we typically think of codes, where there's a set of rules In this case, we have instructions. It's kind of like a recipe to follow, right? Where there's less need for a designer or builder or energy modelers to be involved. You get points basically for each level for certain levels of insulation in different areas. If you choose a higher performance furnace or a electric heat pump system, you'll get a certain amount of points. And the number of points you get in this system determines which tier you end up getting to. So if your goal is to get to a tier 3 on the prescriptive path, let's say you need a certain amount of points to do that, and this kind of walks you through how to get those points. So that's one way to meet the tiered energy code, and the other is from a performance perspective. And when we talk about building performance, we're really talking about energy modeling. So modeling buildings to understand how they're going to perform before we make them and before we design them and build them, and make sure that the amount of energy that's modeled to be used in the building is significantly better than code. And we can show you, I think in the next slide, where those energy levels land. Oh no, that's a bit later. So
Trevor?
Yep.
It's just coming up to the top of
Yes.
the hour.
I was just about
And
to say.
so we might want to have a little break, see if anybody's got any questions. I've been feeding people some information in the chat, but maybe it's a good time to ask if there's any other questions to date, or to date to this point. For now, and if we want to maybe take a break, or if people are good for, we had set it up so there would be 2 breaks. Maybe people are okay with having 1 break in the middle at the 90-minute point. Depends on how you're feeling too.
Yeah, I can go either way for sure. I think it might make sense to take a short break now.
Okay.
I know that there's definitely less slides in the second. So just to go over what we were just talking about before break, right? Right now we're talking about tiered building codes. We'll get into a bit more detail on that and how there are 2 different ways to meet the building code in these new tiered codes. A prescriptive path, like following a set of rules, and a performance path where we can make our own design as long as that meets the performance requirements of the building. And there's different ways to prove that, like through energy modeling and air tightness testing, things like that, so we can assure that the performance of the building meets the specific parts of the code and the tier of the code that we're shooting for.
With the performance-based part of it, we're really focusing on the building envelope as well. So actually making sure that regardless of how you're looking after the space, cooling, heating, ventilation, that the building itself is what makes it energy efficient.
Right. Yeah, and that's an interesting approach too, because certain parts of the building are assumed to be permanent, right? So yeah, like your walls and your roof and your floors, whereas other parts like furnaces and heating systems and cooling systems are assumed to be, have a 30-year lifespan and get swapped out over time. So to have a really good building enclosure means that in the future, we have more options for what heating and cooling systems we use, what types of renewable energy we generate. So it's all good. So next we're going to talk a little bit, at least give one example about how codes are enacted. And so this is a bit complicated because there's various, like we kind of talked about, like legal frameworks for this. But what we can sort of summarize is how the National Building Code of Canada gets revised and updated every 5 years. And each version of the code can be adopted and adapted by each jurisdiction, primarily provincial jurisdictions for the most part. So it all starts with the model code, right? So if we let's look at as an example what BC has done since 2010. So in 2010, BC adopted the model building code, the National Building Code of Canada, as did other provinces and territories. But in 2012, it was introduced in 2010, adopted by BC in 2012. And so the BC building code is an objective-based code based on the NBC 2010. So 2 years later, they adopted that national model code from 2010. In 2014, the city of Vancouver passed a bylaw. It's the Vancouver Building Bylaw that sort of adopted the BC Building Code and made a few changes to it. In 2015, when a new version of the National Building Code of Canada was adopted or delivered, then the next year, BC then adopted that as the BC Energy Step Code. And so, as we can see, they've tend to be a year or two behind when the delivery of the model code is, but that gives them time to review it, understand how it applies in their situation, and potentially to adapt it to their situation. Now, the City of Vancouver Green Building Standard is a new bylaw that has been passed in the City of Vancouver. And it includes greater performance requirements for certain building components, like the amount of insulation in walls and roofs, and limits the use of gas-fired equipment for heating, so that it's easier to add future renewable energy systems in the future. One of the interesting things about the Vancouver Building Bylaw and the Green Building Standard they've developed is there's now 3 different ways to comply. There's a prescriptive path, like we talked about, a set of rules and points that you can get by following the rules. There's a performance path, so using energy modeling and using other analysis techniques to make sure the performance of the building meets the requirements. And they've added a third, which is a passive house certification. Passive house is a third-party certification program that really focuses on energy performance in buildings. And so they've added that as a way to comply. So they're now bringing in a sort of third-party, completely outside of the government's reach certification program that's also acceptable as a compliance path. So that's pretty interesting. There is also some really good information online and could be useful if you're looking to develop a local building code, understanding compliance paths for the Vancouver Building Bylaw. And it's been updated just a couple of years ago. Another example of a municipal level green building standard was enacted by the city of Whitehorse. This is a much, I think, a simpler approach. And basically what this bylaw addressed some of the specific local building issues that they were having in the city. This bylaw requires that all new houses have an EnerGuide rating. So EnerGuide is the rating system recognized by Natural Resources Canada. And they have to meet a minimum standard for that. And the other thing that's really, I think, interesting in this approach was that the city of Whitehorse's bylaw requires blower door air tightness testing of the buildings, and also requires that the buildings meet a certain standard, which is 1.5 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. And so what they realized from the past was that even when we start making buildings more well insulated, we can still have moisture problems if we don't have proper building air tightness. And they've legislated that above and beyond the National Building Code. I visited Whitehorse a few months ago and spoke with some builders because my experience in Ontario is that builders would have a real problem with this. Speaking with the builders there, they adapted to it very quickly and are having great success with that. Regularly exceeding 1.5 air changes per hour by quite a bit, making their buildings more airtight than required. There's a few other requirements listed here within that, including freeze protection for footings and other issues where they windows, a minimum of R4 for windows. So issues that they've noticed and found over the years, they've tried to address those in their own local bylaw. And so I think this is a good sort of model as to how a community could address this with using their building bylaw type setup. Now we're going to talk in a little more detail about the BC Energy Step Code because it relates a lot to the upcoming National Building Code we talk about. The BC Energy Step Code was developed in 2017 to create a pathway to net zero housing by 2032. So their goal was to take this code, create these different steps, and by 2032, get all new housing to the level of net zero ready. There's a range of effective insulation levels for the foundations, walls, and roofs, and window performance, and etc. for each climate zone. So they've broken this down by different climate zones, which I'll show you in a minute. There's an air tightness requirement, and the insulation values all increase with each step. So we need to become more airtight. Higher levels of insulation are required to reach each step. Mechanical systems must meet higher efficiency ratings as we move into colder climate zones and as we move up the different steps and tiers. And this is for Part 9 buildings specifically. And because of the performance-related way that this can be adhered to, it allows designers and builders to choose the appropriate approach that works for them, that meets the requirements. And they're using much less prescriptive approaches and much more performance-based approaches to achieve this. So the step code defines different energy performance targets based on climate zone. So here's just an example of Vancouver or British Columbia's climate zones. The climate zones are defined by the average number of heating degree days. So heating degree days is a way to look at how much heating does a house need in the climate to keep it at a safe level. And so each, and you'll see this in the building code, there's a huge table of heating degree days for basically every major center in the country in the National Building Code. And basically the heating degree days jump up by about 1,000. So for example, climate zone 4, which is just Vancouver and Victoria, is less than 3,000 heating degree days. Climate zone 5 is 3 to 4. Climate zone, as we move up, they move about 1,000 at a time till we get up to, for example, 7B, which is 6,000 to 7,000 heating degree days. And then finally, climate zone 8, which is greater than 7,000 heating degree days. So one thing about climate zone 8 in BC, it makes sense that it really can be its own climate zone. As we look at overall in Canada and into the high Arctic, we can see certain cities that have, or communities that have 10,000, 11,000 heating degree days. So climate zone 8 can be quite different from its warmer to colder zones. But within BC, it works really well. So the reason BC adopted their step code was in anticipation of the National Building Code 2020, which introduced the tiered approach to the national code. So it has a tiered approach to energy performance, again, based on our requirements or our commitments from the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which is a set of targets that call for working towards net zero energy buildings by 2032. And as we know, a net zero energy building is one that produces as much renewable energy on site as it uses. So the Model Energy Code for 2020 has 4 levels. So it has a base level. The base level is, what the starting point we're using, and very much related to the previous building code. Then
that's based on NBC 2015.
2015
reference or base. So that's where the base. That's what everything has to start at.
Right.
And only get better.
Right. And that's the way designers are used to designing, builders are used to building now. And then it adds these different tiers. So tier 2 would require 25% improvement in energy efficiency of the buildings. So far, tier 2 has been adopted by Saskatchewan and the Yukon. But not all provinces and areas are working to that yet. Step 3 of the model code requires a 50% reduction in energy efficiency, and step 4, 60%. And so the idea being step 4, when we get to about 60% reduction or improvement in energy efficiency, now we get into the zone where we can possibly create enough energy on site and get to that net zero energy performance. So different provinces are at different levels of adopting this code. As we move forward, we're going to see more and more adoption of the different levels or steps of the code. What's coming up next? Now we're going to start to see codes that go beyond just energy efficiency, but start to look at carbon emissions. And so the zero carbon step code was introduced in 2023 as an update to the BC building code. So as you can start to get the impression that BC kind of leads the way on these code issues related to energy efficiency, and where they're going next is to not only think about energy efficiency, but carbon emissions reductions. The low carbon code provides several options to reduce the amount of operational carbon emissions from a building by lowering the emissions from space heating and water heating systems. So primarily that means you can only go so far with energy efficiency on heating systems and water heating systems that use fossil fuels. So that really means that we start to switch over to electric-based systems and then make sure that we're able to create that electricity with renewable resources like solar and wind power. Upcoming in the code will be applying the step code to alterations to existing buildings, so renovations code. So the new section of the building code is being developed, and they're looking to adopt it by 2030 to fill the gap in energy conservation and building science when it comes to improving the existing housing stock. So it's always easier, I think, when you're starting from scratch, to design, a building and design an energy efficient building. When it comes to trying to alter buildings that already exist, it can be more challenging, but that's where we need to get to, because we're not going to just replace all of our buildings in a short period of time. We're going to need to update them and to improve them. And so the code is starting to look at that. So this is where the break normally was going to be. We can take any questions for sure we can take. Otherwise, I'll move on to section 2.
Yeah, if anybody wants to throw questions into the chat, I can relay them, or we can keep going.
Okay, that's great. That's fine. So
Yeah,
we're gonna.
I mean, if you, yeah, but just before we jump into this next part, if anybody does want to ask a question, just put it
Mhm.
into the chat, and I'll jump into Trevor's flow.
Yeah, no problem. No problem at all. If you have questions, we might as well, yeah, let's talk about them as we go. Okay, so on to part 2, we're going to talk a little bit more about code compliance, and we're going to start off with some polls, I think, right? Do we have poll number 4 ready to go?
There we go.
Oh, look at that. Now I can see them. That's great. So yes or no, my community has adopted the National Building Code. So far, we are 3 for 3 on yes, we have adopted it. That might be all we get. Okay, so we definitely are seeing some adoption going on in the communities that we're working with or dealing with here today. Next question on a scale of 1 to 10. How much do you think overcrowding affects your community? So 10 being it affects it a lot, 0 being not at all. Okay, so we've got definitely a few communities that are very high, 9s and 10s on how much overcrowding is affecting the community. So that's interesting. We'll talk. We've talked a bit
There's
about.
also
Yep.
also one in the chat that somebody's put in the number 3.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we have a few that it's not a major problem. Then we have 3 where it's a very important issue for them. Okay, great. Oops,
Excuse me.
there we go.
I think we missed one of the questions, the polls in the very beginning.
Oh, did we? Okay.
And the question, I'll ask it, is who do you think has authority, is the authority having jurisdiction in your community? Which means who's the person or who's the entity that is in charge of enforcing the building code? And you could just throw that right into the chat and I'll read them out. I got one, the city of Winnipeg.
Okay.
Because that's the basis for the next piece
Right.
of the presentation is who's in charge, who gets to be the person.
So from the view of the federal and provincial government, from their point of view, they don't have any way of enforcing fire or building codes on First Nations. There's been talk in the past of a legislative fix, but it would be a major change to the legal system to do that. And so, yeah, the question is if the federal government or the provincial government aren't going to take responsibility for enforcing building codes on First Nations, then who is? So in many Indigenous construction projects, the funding organizations, so typically CMHC or Indigenous Services Canada, require that the projects adhere to the building code of the province or territory that they're happening under. Under the Indigenous Services Act and the National Housing Act, Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing are the primary federal government organizations responsible for supporting housing in First Nations and communities, but they are not the authority when it comes to the building code. So the authority having jurisdiction is the community. Chief and council basically are responsible for making sure that the housing that's being built in the community meets the building code. First Nations are responsible providing and managing housing on reserve, as well as maintaining and repairing, collecting rent, etc. That's all comes down to the local level, the chief and council specifically.
Yeah, I think if you want to just go back to that piece, that slide just for a minute, because I want to point out that it's actually that clause or that subclause 81(1)(h) that the chief and council are responsible for the regulation of construction, repair, and use of buildings. So in communities, you can take that responsibility and claim that authority, and then you can do all sorts of great things great things for the community and within the community. Of course, that the big challenge is capacity there. So.
Right. Because we talked about jurisdictions that adopted the code and altered it, and there's ways, and reasons to do that, and that's one way that it definitely could be done at the band level, using the powers of chief and council to do that. So there are 3 steps required for code compliance in the process, right? So before construction, the authority having jurisdiction needs to review the plans, drawings, and specifications to make sure that they comply with the code. And then they issue a permit. That's typically how it works. Step number 2 is that the site inspections are used to ensure that the ground is prepared properly for the foundation, that the wall and roof framing meets code requirements for structural safety, and all the other areas of especially part 9 for houses is met in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of water management, etc. All those things. That's all done by site inspection during construction. And then finally, step 3 is the final inspection needs to be signed off that would grant occupancy based on code compliance. And that typically comes down to making sure that guardrails and stairs and handrails are in place, and those type of features are ready before someone moves in. But step 1 and step 2 are the ones that really take a lot of effort to an understanding of the code to make sure that the design meets the code, and then that the building is built to that design and to the building code. It's important to note that CMHC funded projects require inspections, but they're just progress inspections. Have the walls been put up yet, etc.? Have the windows been put in? For releasing of payments, they have nothing to do with making sure that everything is code compliant. So they're not compliant. The CMHC inspections are not compliance inspections, they're just progress inspections. And there's no specific requirements under the funding agreements for the design review of designs and plans. So that really has to come upon the authority having jurisdiction, the community itself.
One of the big issues with that is that if something is wrong in the design or plan, it's baked in right from the very beginning. So you do get the dilapidated buildings happening really quickly, because the problems were baked in right from the get-go. Right.
And what we see in the north, and especially in the far north, is that these plans that come in plans that were used in southern Canada and just transplanted there without a lot of thought for the building science requirements that, some of the things we're going to talk about later, and making sure that they can perform under the conditions that they're being used. So the biggest risk factor here is that without an inspection system of plans and of the construction itself, that the dwellings constructed and renovated, even with departmental subsidies or government subsidies, will not meet the required standards. They won't perform the way you want them to or expect them to. So we need to figure out a way to get these, these 3 steps in the process, in your process. So since 1983, all government funding agencies require that new housing is code compliant, but they don't do the inspection for code compliance. As we said, it's a responsibility of the community to do that. And as we know, poorly built housing, whether it's from the design or construction side or both, increases the risk of fire, structural decay, and the need for repairs. It also affects occupant health, indoor air quality because of moisture and mold and all those issues that we talked about. And so we know that inadequate and inappropriate buildings have consequences in our communities, and we want to make sure that we have a way and a process that works for us to make sure that at least new housing and when we renovate housing, that it gets done properly. And the code is one way we can do that. So we talked about a little bit about capacity. Shauna mentioned that not every community has a building inspector. Not every community has skilled trades that can follow the plans, and or someone to read the plans and know that they've are meet code. And that's when we get into other structures outside of individual communities. So one method that a lot of communities are using to adopt the code is through tribal councils, and they're the technical departments within the tribal councils. This allows for building code specialists, building inspectors, and other experts to serve multiple communities in the same region. And one example we'll talk a little bit about is Ogamawaj Tribal Council, also known as the Six Nation Alliance. You can see the communities that are involved in that. So the OTC, the Ogamawaj Tribal Council, provides guidance, assistance, and advocacy for its members, for its member communities, in relation to all types of community infrastructure, planning, and development, including housing. So this includes advising and assisting member communities on housing inspections, building code inspections, plan inspections, the tendering process even, and other sort of things for other technical needs when it comes to developing housing. And also in relation to developing bylaws and how to, annual reporting of the outcomes of these projects. The OTC also works in conjunction with member communities to coordinate relevant training and workshops for First Nations technical staff. So that's another really important way that tribal councils can, work and provide services to their member communities is through training and workshops. Specifically, OTC provides code services. So basically they cover the services needed to ensure compliance with the building code. So that would include reviewing the plans and providing those on-site inspections that are required to make sure that the construction is happening to the plans and to the building code. They also provide advice and resources to promote better practices. So maybe things where we need to go above and beyond code. This is where a tribal council with some housing expertise can really help their member communities figure that out and figure out, what are the areas where the code doesn't really address our needs and we need to go above and beyond. And that includes the development of housing policies that they can assist with also. So that's just one example of a tribal council. Another is going to be a group that we call FINBOA. First, let me read this quote from Keith Miracle. We have a really hard time getting building codes administered at the First Nations level because the building inspector has no authority. I go into a community and look at a house and write a report, and there's something wrong. When I go back the next time, it's still the same way. Nothing was done. The contractor was paid and on his way, and now we have another dilapidated house, built dilapidated to start with. So this speaks to like not only having the inspections done, but having the authority to follow up and make sure that anything gets that was identified gets fixed. So another way in which we can look at getting this type of inspection done is through the group called the First Nations National Building Officers Association, which I typically call FINBOA. So the name building officer was selected because it incorporates the daily activities of the First Nations inspector, whose tasks are many and varied. So it's not just looking at plans, not just doing inspections. They sort of have a variety of tasks that they perform in the community. Currently, there are 7 chapters covering BC, the territories, the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic. So they are nationwide, and they're still growing and becoming more relevant and more useful to the communities as we go. But really good resources are available at FINBOA's website. I think we'll have that as one of our resources.
Yeah.
So FINBOA represents individuals. Okay, so they work with individual First Nations housing experts or housing coordinators, and they work as a technical service providers to different communities. They're establishing national occupational standards to ensure minimum core competencies. So to make sure that if you're a FINBOA inspector, you have a minimum level of education and training. They're also establishing certification and accreditation process. One of the things that they do is to ensure programs and policies for capacity development are developed for the sector. And they advocate for housing policies that will lead to better building and renovation practices. And obviously, the ultimate goal of improving the overall housing conditions of First Nations communities. So they're working towards all those goals. FINBOA has identified 6 top issues that they see in their communities. The first is poor specifications. So materials or equipment that are either not to code or not suitable for the community. So that comes down to that planning phase, right? Reviewing plans and knowing that if the materials and equipment specified are code compliant and if they are appropriate. Number 2, just avoiding permits. So contractors that do not adhere to rules and regulations that are placed in other municipalities and not taking out permits. And again, that comes down to the authority having jurisdiction. So that chief and council and the community requiring permits. And that's one of the issues. If they don't require permits, then how do we make sure we're following the building code and other processes? Number 3 was lack of accountability.
I think also with avoiding permits, the fact is that those outside contractors must adhere to those rules and regulations in non-Indigenous communities, so they know what the problems are and they know what the issues are and they know that they should be hitting certain standards. But because the permit is not required, it's a free-for-all.
Right. If permits and inspection points aren't utilized, then it's really up to the contractor to do whatever they feel like doing that day. And that typically that doesn't work out well. I was a contractor. I work with contractors who are very good, but there's a lot who just will cut corners when available. So it's really important that we have accountability for the designers and the people, the contractors who build our homes. So that was number 3, is lack of accountability. So basically, once the house is built, any repair costs or maintenance costs are on the community now. So they're not, the builder's long gone at that point. Number 4, they have issues with holdbacks. So enforcing holdbacks based on performance restricts the ability to enforce code compliance. So if we don't use holdbacks and contractors get paid whether they do a good job or not, and if we don't have a system to know whether they did a good job or not, once they have their money, it's really hard to get them to come back and make changes and fix mistakes that they made.
And then there's also the point of that if you do enforce holdbacks, then the community has a reputation of not paying. Right? Which means that, oh, don't work for them, they won't pay. But the actual fact is you will pay. We just want to make sure you did the work right. This is kind of standard operation.
This is
pretty much everywhere else,
yes.
Right? Holdbacks and is not a surprise for any contractor in a non-Indigenous world.
Yeah. I'm not really sure point 5 was, but building permit is an off-reserve term that is sometimes not accepted in a community. So similar to number 2, we need to make sure that there's a building permit process in place and that the contractors are held responsible for that. And number 6, contractor problems, what they call short-term build. So again, materials and equipment that may not be approved for use in other places are being used on reserve because of the lack of oversight. And that can result in poor performance in the long term for buildings, premature decay and issues of quality and maintenance because it was not looked at, the building was not looked at as a resource in the long term. It was just when cost is the primary driver, we end up with a lot of compromises and a lot of inappropriate materials and techniques used. So that's sort of one of the some of the issues that we see when we use outside contractors. And these can be the same issues when using internal contractors if they're not conscientious. But ultimately, the onus is on the community, chief and council, to make sure there's a system in place to avoid these issues. Also, just to note, when we're going to talk a lot about energy and focus a lot on the energy benefits with building codes. There's also a lot of other important benefits that come with the adoption and the adaptation of building codes. And these are the things that we really prioritize in our housing, and that's like safe and healthy housing, right? Those are the 2 primary ones. We want people to live in their house to be safe, and they want them to be healthy. Their house should not be making them sick. We also can use the code to improve the durability of our buildings, to make them last longer, to have lower maintenance, and to provide shelter for 50+ years if they're designed and built properly. And finally, resiliency. So our buildings can be designed to withstand different natural disasters potentially, or high wind events, floods, fires. All those things can be handled or can be addressed using the building code. If we know what our priorities are as a community, we can use the code to help us develop resilient housing too.
So these are all called non-energy benefits, and they all stem from energy efficiency work. But the focus, the cool thing is that we can turn it around and say, we can build comfortable, safe, healthy, durable, resilient houses. And by the way, they're going to save you some energy. Like it becomes a bonus point as opposed to the actual reason why you're creating a high performance house.
Right.
And that's kind of cool to turn that whole thing on its end. And that's why we can use the code to drive home as a refuge.
That's right. And there's certain, elements we'll talk about when we talk about the house as a system, where durability and energy efficiency can go hand in hand and work together. We'll talk a bit about that, specifically building air tightness. We'll talk about.
Yeah, and we're just, again, we're about 5 minutes away from the top of the hour again. So just for timing, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I would suggest that we kind of zip through the next few slides, because this is more focused on this idea, but it's important, but it's the idea that you have the authority, you are the authority that has jurisdiction.
Right.
And then we can build into that the idea of sovereignty, but I really want to get us into some of those good juicy examples that we got coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so because the community is the authority having jurisdiction, we can use that as a benefit to really create our own sovereignty within the community on how housing gets designed and built. That's really the point of this slide. And then we want to, we can maybe get a little bit into this before break, which is all about, the house as a system and using building science, our knowledge of building science, to help us work with the code and create that healthy, safe, durable building that's also energy efficient.
Yeah, for me, this is the part of this is the two-eyed seeing. Sorry,
Yes,
got all
absolutely. Yeah,
tumbled up on myself there. That the building code, the high performance building codes, are based on building science. So it's a lot of the building science is cooked into the code, and now you can take that code and you can build it further. You can build it further. You can build out into healthy, safe, durable, resilient by using building science,
absolutely,
which is also in the building code, backed up in the building code.
Absolutely. And yeah, when we talk about the house as a system, we're saying that all the things are interconnected and affect each other. So the occupants, for example, are, part of the ecosystem of the house and affect how it performs. So is the building envelope. How are the walls and roof and windows designed? Same with the mechanical systems. And if we change one, how does it affect the other? And so we always want to think about that in terms of, we don't just want to add insulation. We want to understand, if we add insulation, how does it affect the occupants? How does it affect mechanical systems? How does it affect moisture? Those are the kind of things that we need to keep in mind when we're making changes or designing a building. So real quick on this one, the knowledge we have in building science, we're actually very lucky in Canada because we have a long history of building science research. And the Saskatchewan Conservation House was one of the original sort of modern version of a high performance house based on building science. We won't get into all the details of it, other than it was designed to be highly insulated, have passive solar design. It also has an active solar system and heat recovery ventilation system. And so those were all very new concepts at that time. The other thing that is also really important about the Saskatchewan house is it made us realize how important the air tightness of the building enclosure is. So maybe I'll get through this little section and then we'll have another break. And so when we talk about air tightness of buildings, we talk about, sometimes we talk about the energy benefits of that, because we can lose a lot of heat and energy due to a leaky building. But there's also a lot of other important benefits to having an airtight building enclosure. And those are mostly related to condensation and moisture issues and mold growth. The way we test a building for air tightness is with a blower door. It's a really important tool that we have to test buildings, because if we don't test a building for air tightness, we don't know how airtight it is, and we just kind of have to wait for it to have problems or not. If we test it ahead of time, we can head off those problems before they occur. I guess it's also really important to know that, just jumping back quick before the break, air tightness affects not only energy, more importantly, it affects occupant comfort and, more importantly, health, because of that condensation problem that we kind of talked about, and how, especially in cold climates, even a little bit of air leakage into a wall or a roof system can move a lot of moisture into the roof or wall and can create mold and rot and decay that way. So air tightness is one thing that's really important, that's come up as a building science principle that we need to address when we're talking about healthy, durable housing. Okay, I think we're close enough to the top of the hour now to maybe take a break. Let's see if we can't definitely get going again by yeah, now that we have tiered codes now and in the future, becoming more and more popular and more available, it really changes the way we can use codes. Especially performance-based codes allow us to use innovative and new materials, or familiar materials in a new way to meet different energy targets. For an example, most people interpret the code requirement for a vapor barrier to mean the house has to have a specific material that is 6 mil poly, the plastic sheet behind the drywall. That's been the standard practice. But actually, if you look at the code from a performance standpoint, there's a lot of different ways to get vapor control, other materials, and other approaches that can work really well. And it just allows for more innovative approaches, basically. So that's a really good thing moving forward. The other thing we want to talk about is that the ownership patterns, we say, within Indigenous communities. So in non-Indigenous communities, home ownership often leads towards short-term thinking, right? Short returns on investment, because they're going to resell this house. They don't want to put too much into it. It's a little bit different in Indigenous communities, with community ownership of housing. Really promotes a long-term view of housing, and maybe spending more money up front to have efficient housing, healthy housing, maybe housing that has less requirements for maintenance, right? All those things allow, I think, is a real opportunity to make different decisions and better decisions. All right, so I think that's an important way to look at it. Another thing just to mention is that some builders that are working towards step 3 of the BC step code have found that there's really not much more of a price increase in building to step 3. It just takes knowledge of how to do it and the most effective ways to get there. So things like that, as we learn more about building to different levels and what the cost implications are, can really be valuable for Indigenous communities that have a long-term view of housing.
There's also the just in terms of retrofits, there's a European movement called Energy Sprong, which is retrofitting houses to net zero in bulk. And it works in Europe because there are similar community ownership patterns. So that's another piece to look at outside of code, but another very interesting piece to look at.
Right. Another thing is just trying to understand, the actual cost and the actual value of a house. So it's important to know that construction is really only 10% of the total cost of a building over its lifespan. So if we start to think about this as a total cost of ownership, looking at all costs associated with the building, including the energy it uses, the maintenance and repair it's required, we can start to make different judgments and value judgments and decisions, and maybe spend more money up front and make design decisions that will save us money in the long term, knowing that we're going to own and operate this home for 50 plus years. Now we can do a quick case study of Seabird Island. So in 2002, an early showcase of sustainable housing was built by First Nations on Seabird Island. So some of the sustainable building features fit the traditional learning and cultural ways, like lighting, like living light on the land, using local materials, minimizing energy use, and optimizing for renewable energy. The homes were designed to benefit from solar positioning, wind patterns, and even earth energy. The main living area and the solariums are oriented to the south in a semicircular pattern around communal healing garden. And this healing garden is the focal point of the site, which shows the 4 directions design pattern. So just an example of one community that tried to think outside the box and take a different approach to housing. And not just the individual houses, but sort of the neighborhood design too, right? How it fits into the community. Oh, did I skip one? No. That's weird. Oh, there we go. Another example in 2005, Northland's Denisoline First Nation, along with the University of Manitoba, they came up with a architectural design and asked the question, starting with the question, how is our housing affecting our health? And so they studied this in order to come up with their own housing design. The outcome of this review in this study was a book called Sekue, which is Dene for My House, that captures the vision, the design, the creation of housing plans and specific elements that would work to support the Dene First Nation on their path for improved health through housing. So just a different lens completely to look at it through in terms of health and interesting outcomes. Another example is the Nuxalt Housing Specialist, or the Nuxalt First Nation, and their development of a high-performance housing guidelines. So their advisor, Richard Hall, who has 35 years of building experience as a Red Seal carpenter, recently produced the book, or the specifications, called the West Coast Building Standards for Residential Construction. This publication has been developed in partnership with RDH Building Science and David Wong of Sea to Sky Architecture, with support from BC Hydro and BC Housing. And the goals of this project were to develop high performance, durable housing that were culturally appropriate designs and were climate appropriate designs. So really important to address those 2 elements. So some of the features that these houses have include clear span floor and roof trusses that allow walls to be moved around and reconfigured over time. And so making them adaptable. Just one of the examples, again, of a community taking a local approach and finding out what they need and how to design to that. The big part of this was designing to combat moisture. So obviously on the West Coast, rain is a very big issue to deal with. How'd they deal with that? They started with 3-foot roof overhangs and metal roofs, a rain screen, so an air gap behind all of their cladding and exterior surfaces to allow water to dry out and to allow cross ventilation to dry out walls. They position windows to allow ventilation within rooms. They used interior venting in closets because they were having issues with dampness in closets where clothes were drying. They used mold-resistant drywall, compound, and fiber tapes. And they used a design feature of mudrooms being outside the main building envelope, where wet clothing and wet materials and equipment can be stored outside of the main building. So yeah, just a few resources that are available to you through the Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative. So they have this West Coast Building Standard, is something you can get, as well as a new housing primer, housing specifications booklet and guide, and a specific toolkit on heat pump technology and how to install and design for heat pumps. So those are all available to you in the resources. Another example we're going to talk about is Georgina Island. So it's a 3,500 acre island of reserve land, which is a permanent home to roughly 200 band members, and also hosts hundreds of cottagers on their 3 islands throughout the summer. While Georgina Island was operating under the Indian Act land management regime, cottagers had been doing all kinds of things, including DIY septic systems that were leaching wastewater into the lake, which was also their drinking water. And so they realized they had to do something specific about this. And so what they did, after becoming chief in 1993, Bill McHugh was introduced the framework agreement on a First Nations land management approach, which promised to relieve the First Nations of some of their constraints imposed by the Indian Act and give them more control over their land. So in 1996, the band members voted overwhelmingly to adopt this land code. And it was implemented, I believe, in January of 2000 at the start of the new century. So really interesting, a way to approach not housing specifically, but housing with land under this, as looking at ways to manage their lands outside of the Indian Act. And yeah, so there's a little more information on that land specifically at this resource that's available, the First Nations Land Management Resource Center. So if you go to their website, there's a lot of really good resources on how to start the process if you're looking at that approach to land management. And in bringing in building code adaptation into that land management code framework is something that they're doing that makes a lot of sense and is another approach that might be useful. And maybe a way that, again, bringing more control back to First Nations overall. So I'm going to skip the break because we're a little behind. We're going to move on to part 3. We do have some polls for part 3, I think poll 6, related to adopting the code. Do we have poll 6 ready? Yeah. Which of these statements applies to your experience? So again, any communities that have adopted the NBC, that have their own building officers, or that operate under a land code. And you can, I think, choose multiple answers on that, right? So we definitely have people who know of communities that adopted the NBC, right? And then we've already know that the home communities of participants have adopted it. We don't see any examples of communities that have their own building officers or communities that are operating under a land code. So that's relatively new. I believe we also have another poll question asking what kinds of resources would be useful to your community to help build capacity to become the authority having jurisdiction. This is just, you can type in anything you want into this one.
I think you could also throw it into the chat if you
Yeah, Yep.
need a little bit more time to consider what those might be.
Yeah, using the chat in that way would be useful. So yeah, think about what kinds of resources, what kind of partnerships would be useful to help your community become the, become the authority having jurisdiction. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about going beyond code or using the code in creative ways. I'm going to go quickly through this because I think there's some great examples at the end that I don't want to miss. But we're just going to look at quickly at some examples where the building code doesn't quite adequately address the requirements for some northern Indigenous housing communities. For example, we talked about home occupancy. We know that, especially in the north, in the far north, there's a lot more the overcrowding than the code would assume there would be. For example, the National Occupancy Standard assumes occupancy of no more than 2 people to a bedroom. And so we're obviously seeing in overcrowded situations communities that have many more people living in a house than just 2 per bedroom. Also, it relates to the NBC and how it requires ventilation for a home based on the number of bedrooms, right? So it's assumed that the number of occupants is equal to the number of bedrooms plus 1. And overcrowded conditions are obviously not, they're not accounted for in the code. And so maybe the required ventilation in the code doesn't really apply or should be looked at more carefully when we know that we have overcrowded conditions. So it may be necessary to look at, specify greater levels of ventilation and look at other things to help reduce condensation due to high RH, like window specifications and whole building air tightness. We might want to look at specifications that go above and beyond the code to account for that overcrowding. Another example is vented roofs. Basically, the code states that except where it can be shown to be unnecessary, where insulation is installed between a ceiling and the underside of roof sheathing, a space shall be provided between the insulation and the sheathing, and vents shall be installed to permit the transfer of moisture from the space to the exterior. So kind of long-winded, but the important thing to note is that they specify that there should be ventilation above an insulated ceiling. And, this has sort of been the norm and the standard for like over 100 years in Canadian homes. But there's some issues with that in some areas. So the code may not apply for several reasons in your community. I know that in the certain communities in the Arctic, the snow is so fine and the wind is blowing enough that so regularly it can blow snow into the attic vents, and that can create moisture issues in the house. So we have to worry about that. Also, the air leakage from the house into the attic may exceed what ventilation can remove. So the code assumes a certain amount of air leakage occurs between the house and into the attic. But if in reality we're seeing more than that, we might need more ventilation, or we might decide to do something alternative. There are different types of attic vents that prevent snow intrusion that could be specified in your community if that's a problem. And there are also unvented roof designs that can be very effective in northern climates. And that's what I'm seeing more and more of in the communities in the Arctic, is that houses that were designed with vented attics are being converted to unvented roof designs. So many of the recently built roofs in Nunavut actually are failing because the ventilation was removed from the design without understanding the building science of that. So remember, the house as a system, you can't just take away something without understanding how that's going to affect it. And so that's kind of what happened here, that they knew that venting wasn't working for them in these vaulted ceilings, so they just took away the venting. Well, that resulted in air leakage, condensation, and a lot of other problems. What we've seen in many of the older roofs in Nunavut. If you've ever see photos like this, where it looks like the roof is a separate extended piece to the rest of the house. So the picture on the bottom, see how the gable end sticks out further. And the reason it looks that way, that is not how it was originally built. It was originally built with a vented attic, but that is added exterior insulation that was added to the gable ends and to the top of the roof to convert that from a vented attic to an unvented attic. And those are actually, under the ones that I've reviewed, are actually performing very well from a moisture standpoint. So again, understanding that sort of house as a system and using building science, we can actually create unvented attics and use that little slice of the code that said where it can be, unless it can be deemed unnecessary. And so in cases like this, we can show that venting is unnecessary if it's designed properly as an unvented roof. The thermal envelope and the amount of insulation that's specified is actually quite addressed relatively well within the building code. So the NBC section 936 specifies different minimal insulation levels for different climate zones. As we know, and each of these climate zones, like we talked about before, has different minimum requirements for wall, roof, and foundation insulation levels, as well as window performance, with obviously the colder climates requiring higher levels of insulation. That's primarily done for energy purposes. And one thing to note, we talked about how each of these climate zones is a 1,000 span of heating degree days. However, zone 8 spans from 7,000 heating degree days to up to 11 or 12,000 heating degree days. And so having that as one climate zone might not be appropriate for certain parts of the building code. And you may, if you live in Iqaluit and you're designing homes, you may not, you may want to go above and beyond the building code in certain circumstances. So although the code does address building, climate in that way, there may be some areas where local conditions may be different than are addressed by the code. Building to minimum code has its cost, right? It's probably is the cheapest upfront cost for building. But as we said before, there's more to it, the cost of owning a home than just the upfront cost. And building to minimum code really does result in higher energy use for the entire lifespan of the building. It may result in a shorter lifespan of the building in terms of moisture damage, rot and decay, and mold growth by just building to minimum code. And so we always look to what are the best and places to spend our upfront money and go above and beyond code so that we can improve the durability, improve the health and safety of the building. And so remember that that upfront cost is only a small portion of the cost of the home. And there is a high cost to building to minimum code in some cases. How communities use buildings is also not dictated by the code. And some traditional practices and cultural uses of buildings were not accounted for by building code requirements that were informed by non-Indigenous practices and uses. There's opportunities for Indigenous communities to adapt building science-based codes to create guidelines and learning paths that reflect local knowledge and the cultural uses of the building, while at the same time enhancing and maintaining comfort, health, and safety and energy efficiency. So make the best practices, making a sort of series of best practice decisions by blending local knowledge with building science is something that I think moving forward using the code the way it's set up can be done and can be very useful to build to the way the buildings are being used. We're going to go a bit more into land codes. We talked a bit about the Georgina Island and what they did. We're going to talk a bit more about land codes. So land codes are a comprehensive law created by individual First Nations to replace 32 sections of the Indian Act related to land management. This means that Canada is no longer involved in all of the same decision-making as regarding First Nations land and resources if we go to these land code approaches. Land code does not have to be approved by the minister or any federal department. It's already set up in the legal system to occur. So how do they work? So first of all, land codes apply only to reserve lands, and they do not affect treaty or constitutional rights. Also, they don't allow the land to be sold or the title transferred. The title is still within the federal government. So how does it happen? So if a community decides to adopt a land code, okay, they can go through that process, and using that, they then can develop their own land use bylaws. And so that could include building codes and how you apply them, and possibly adapting building codes to meet the needs of the community. So after they're developed the bylaws, they need to adapt some type of code, whether it's pre-existing or something that they've, from the model code that they've altered. And then, that allows us to sort of change the way we deal with our land. And there's a lot of great resources. I think I mentioned this earlier, and we'll have this in our resource guide, which is the Land Advisory Board and Resource Center, LABRC, that sort of lay out how this works and how it can go forward. So most First Nations who have adopted the land codes have not created their own codes, but incorporated provincial codes or national building codes, and maybe changed and added to it using bylaws. And so that's kind of one of the approaches to use to really customize the building code to meet your needs. It's also sort of a larger scale project that has other implications, right? So to date, more than 160 First Nations have adopted land codes. 88 First Nations are operating under those land codes. Some are currently in development, 31. And some communities are in the process of, they've adopted, but just haven't activated or adopted them yet. So some cool things that came out of the survey of First Nations that adopted land code, they saw a 40% increase in new business development, which is really exciting. 4,000 jobs created by 32 First Nations that have land codes that were in the survey. So it has some implications, obviously, outside of building codes and even housing development, but to the, the way in which the whole community works. They've also reduced their permit approval process dramatically using this process. So just a couple of things that have come out, some of the positive benefits that have been seen so far by the communities that have adopted the land code.
Yeah, when I was looking at that, there was one organization called the Yellowhead Institute that I'm not familiar with at all. But they did have some questions around whether or not this model was forcing a settler or colonial capitalist / all of those things aspect on it. And I'm not, I'm just not able to speak to that at all. I just wanted to bring it to the forefront that that's something that has been brought up as a question. But obviously there's a lot of First Nations who are being successful with this. So
yes. Yeah, there's definitely a different philosophy, I guess, that is involved with land codes. And yeah, if it suits your community, it might be something to look into for sure. So even just using the building code and definitely land codes as they are developed, it really opens up some different ways and innovative approaches to housing. So some specific success stories include communities that have built tiny houses to house like single people and individuals, sometimes typically youth or sometimes elders that are singles and don't need a 3-bedroom home. Also changes to the density of building. There's some pluses and minuses to that, but from a cost perspective, for sure, building tighter, more dense developments is a lower cost approach.
That's also a really good way to work with multi-generational families.
Yep. Right. And not just, yeah, and also you're working with not just the building, but how the community and how the neighborhood is designed, and you know, whether there's communal areas and then individual tighter houses. There's a lot of options there, and yeah, a lot of interest.
So that can sort of roll over into cultural design as well. Is like, how do you want this to be? Do you want it to be little cookie cutter houses, or do you want it to be something that's more cohesive?
Absolutely, yeah. Taking into account how, you know, people live and how they interact with each other is really important and can be used. We can use land codes to do that. Moving to electrification, so moving off of fossil fuels is obviously something that we can start to look at in terms of creating more on-site renewable energy. And how that affects our carbon footprint as a community. Also be used. Can also be used to build local capacity for construction, for design, for inspections, all of those things that relate to creating housing. We can start to use this whole process to build capacity locally. Which is great. And then changing existing buildings and upgrading them from an energy perspective also really opens up a lot of options when we have, you know, flexible building codes like we do. So some of the factors that we want to account for in the development of high quality, durable housing include the local geographic, you know, conditions, risk of flooding, risk of wildfire, risk of high winds. In some communities, limited access to land. There's not a lot of buildable land available. So how do we design to that? Also, what happens, you know, what's your experience in your community with prolonged power outages? How long can a house stay safe without power if you do have a grid that goes down? Also, factors that can be accounted for include cultural practices. If burning wood is an important part of your community, both from a cultural and economic standpoint, how do we design to that, to do that safely? And to do that with good indoor air quality. You know, and how about processing, you know, traditionally harvested food in the home, and what does that require from a design standpoint from the building? So all of these things can be considered when we're looking at developing culturally and climate appropriate housing, and we can use these flexible building codes to do that. As we move towards new and less prescriptive building codes, we're able to utilize more creative solutions and incorporate higher performing levels of the tiered codes that produce all, you know, houses that are safe and affordable and efficient. And again, thinking about, while we're coming up with these designs, thinking about the total cost of ownership of these homes and not just the upfront cost, and how they'll affect the budget of the community in the long term are also really important, and really help us, you know, make those proper decisions, maybe to spend more upfront to have more durable, more efficient housing. We can also, look to local solutions using these performance-based building codes, and look to sort of local solutions that benefit the whole community. So we can look at, you know, different housing types, not just a bunch of 3-bedroom homes, as we talked about, maybe larger homes, maybe smaller homes, depending on the needs of our community. Homes built with materials produced within the community or within, you know, locally within, you know, neighboring communities or in the local area. homes built by qualified community members or members from neighboring communities that have the proper training and experience from this capacity building we're working on. And then obviously, or finally, resilient homes that are built to last a long time. Really important that, we're passing down our housing from, generation to generation and not just replacing it after 10, 15 years, as in some communities are experiencing now. All those are really big community benefits, not just to the individual who lives in the home, but to the whole community. Also, just taking a long-term look and thought about community management. So the adoption and adaption of high-performance building codes is one step to help break the cycle in order to create homes that are healthy, durable, and efficient. So not just thinking about how can we get more housing units quickly, but how can we get housing units that are going to help break this cycle and last a long time and benefit the community for 50 to 100 years. Also just managing inspections within the community to help compliance and improve building outcomes. Of course, this requires capacity building within the community, but there are resources we can work with to get started on that path, and to have an inspector from the community inspect, even if it's work being done by outside contractors. There's really a lot of ownership there for that inspector to make sure that they're getting what they paid for and they agreed upon, and that they're getting quality building that's code compliant. So
there's also there's something that I don't think we talked about very much, but there's a lot of real cool innovations happening. Like Finboa offers tele-inspections, so they can do a video walkthrough, and so you don't have to have an inspector in community on site immediately, so you can actually gather up and utilize resources that are already in place. You don't have to start from zero. You don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons we've looked at all these different resources, is that they're out there.
Yeah, in fact, I'm working with Finboa right now on a pilot project using like 3D cameras, the type of technology used like for Google Earth, where the contractor can just walk through the home while running a video, essentially, that then can turn into a three-dimensional images for inspection purposes. Yeah, taking it to the next level. Yeah, right.
I played with one of those.
Okay, I haven't yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, let's geek right out.
Get all the toys. Yeah, all the tools. Yeah, so another just case study and interesting approach is being used by Anishinaabe-Aski Nation. So Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, we call NAN, represents 49 First Nation communities within Northern Ontario. And it represents the socioeconomic, political aspirations of the First Nation members to all levels of government in order to promote self-determination while establishing spiritual, cultural, social, and economic independence. So in 2014, the NAN Chiefs and Assembly collectively declared a NAN-wide housing state of emergency. As a result of decades of inappropriate housing, NAN communities faced deplorable housing conditions that led to extensive health issues, very short lifespan for the housing, overcrowding, and extreme mold. So their community's ongoing experience of housing insecurity led to this, in 2018, led to another state of emergency being declared, with the chiefs adding, the existing standard housing solutions have not met immediate need and have not addressed future need and have not promoted or created wellness within the community. So they identified this, not just the need for short-term solutions, but for long-term solutions and for solutions that affect health and wellness in the community. They identified this and started to do something about it. So this led to the development of the NAN housing strategy. It started with community engagement. So they started with workshops to understand the existing challenges within the community and to set priorities. So to talk to the community members and say, what are our priorities? What are our challenges? And they came up with 5 themes through these conversations. The need for unique housing design, which addressed the needs of those populations in greatest need, including youth, elders, and singles, okay? So again, this cookie cutter 3-bedroom house wasn't really working for everybody, even as a design, never mind as how it performed. The need for greater environmental considerations in the housing system. So making sure the housing fits within the environment and doesn't have a negative effect on the environment. The need for community-based training for trades, management, and housing maintenance. All these things, similar things we've been talking about, right? And number 5, integrated growth planning. So knowing that their communities were growing, how do they make sure they plan for that in the future? And so they've identified these things and started putting this together as a community housing plan. One of the key findings from the community engagement workshops was the need for sustainable materials and design. So yeah, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom designs weren't really working for them for the most part. Their housing professionals identified that current funding mechanisms, program timelines, and existing capacity levels were not allowing for investment in pre-construction. So that planning process that could generate the locally appropriate designs. The way the housing funding was set up was very much get housing in quickly, whereas they realized that they needed to plan this out more carefully, and they needed funding to do that. They wanted to create alternative housing designs which align with the specific needs and priorities of the community. And then they want these designs to be distributed and used for all First Nations, not just within NAN, but anyone else who had similar issues that they did. So they're working towards that. They want to make sure that the housing was appropriate for the climate and geography in the NAN territory, and also to the conditions inside the home, what people were doing and how they were using their homes. So by adopting current and future building codes and adapting them to meet the needs of your community, you can develop local building standards based on local knowledge and building science principles, and come up with sort of best practices and best approaches for your community. So this involves oftentimes adapting the code and then going beyond code where it makes sense, and developing the mechanisms to support code enforcement during construction. So the result of this process can be a higher standard of construction to meet the specific needs of your community, and utilizing the tools that we have, including the modern National Building Code and how it's set up to meet your needs and to act as a resource for you.
I think, Trevor, I just wanted to pop in and say that NAN is is a really interesting example, because if you can make it work in the north, it's a snap. When you come down off that line, that 60 line.
Yeah.
Right? When you come out of climate zone 8, whatever worked in climate zone 8 is going to be absolutely brilliant anywhere below that.
Yeah, yeah. And most of NAN is within 7A and 7B, but yeah, moving into 8 that's the work I do in the Arctic is very challenging because of that. And yeah, as we get into warmer climates and certainly drier climates than the West Coast, all of these approaches, they still apply, and it's easier to get to the performance we're looking for.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes to the top of the hour.
Yeah, this is the last slide.
I know. Wow.
So important to note that all of the things we're talking about today, the process of adapting the code, and then adapting it and adding to it where needed, this process requires buy-in from community leadership, and it requires capacity development in your community. But if we can do this, we can. It will ultimately lead to higher levels of control within the community about housing, how it's built, how it's designed, and will lead to higher levels of sovereignty within your community regarding housing. And the outcomes is going to be more healthy, durable, and efficient housing, which is the ultimate goal.
So one of the big things that we've tried to do with this presentation is to create a reference document for you that actually goes through all of the a version of the narration that of the presentation, but also has a back end that is links to almost everything that we've talked about. And just before we wrap up, Natoya has put a little quick survey link in the chat. So if you could please fill that out and let Eco Canada know what you thought of this and what you'd like to see going forward, because this is the first introductory step into a bigger and broader program in terms of code and Indigenous communities. And so we're not part of that program ourselves, so I can't speak to it, but Pooja and Natoya and Brett? Oh, Brendan.
Brendan.
Oh, Brendan, sorry, Brendan, are all there to talk to. So they're a good resource, and we will put as many resources into the document as possible. So, any questions?
I'll just throw this one up at the very end again. Yes, funded by the government of Canada. But yeah, I would certainly, if any questions come up, anything that needs clarification based on what we talked about today, and if you don't have time to put it in the questions today, I'm more than willing to answer questions by email or other sources as they come up. And if there's no specific questions, then I guess we could hand it back to Pooja just to close out and say goodbye.
Sounds great.
Thank you everyone for attending the training. Yeah, as my colleague put in the survey link, we can also send it over by email for sure. I know one of the participants asked if we can send it by email. We can. And please do fill it out because as Shauna mentioned, this is our very first course and we are looking for feedback, and we will be developing more training and more awareness sessions after this. So yeah, and if you would like to learn more about the project, the program, what kind of resources we will be developing, there is a question in the survey that's kind of provides us that information that you are looking for more information, and we can follow up with that as well. So yeah, please to let us know what you think of the training. And thank you so much, Trevor. Thank you, Shauna.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you to everyone who attended today, and I hope you got some good information out of it. And yeah, if you do have feedback, please let Pooja know, and we'll make adjustments in the future if that makes sense to do so.
And if you have any questions for Trevor, do let us know. We will forward those questions to Trevor or Shauna.
Yeah, both of us.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you all have a really great day. And yeah, please reach out if you have any questions at all.
Okay, have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day.
You. Bye.
Okay. I think it's just us. I think that's Chase, so we should be fine. Yeah, Chase is our marketing person, our events person. So yeah, he was making sure we have like